At 8:17 on a quiet Saturday morning, a white woman stood on her porch and called the police on the black woman next door. She claimed the woman had no business being in the neighborhood. She claimed she had been acting suspiciously. And when the black woman calmly tried to explain herself, the neighbor pointed at her and demanded that the officers remove her immediately. What the neighbor did not know was that the woman had lived there for 3 years. She owned the house. She had never committed a crime. And the man who was about to arrive in a police vehicle and step onto that street was not just any police officer. He was her husband, the chief of police. But that was not even the worst part, because when the chief arrived, he did not immediately defend his wife. Instead, he looked at her. Then he looked at the neighbor. Then he noticed something in the neighbor's hand that made his entire expression change, something that would turn a simple neighborhood complaint into a police investigation. And by the end of that afternoon, the woman who had called the police thinking she was exposing a stranger would be the one desperately begging them not to arrest her. Before we uncover what happened on that street, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because if you believe nobody should be judged by the color of their skin, their clothes, or where they come from, stay with this story until the very end. You are going to want to see how this one ends. The neighborhood of Maple Ridge looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Large houses stood behind lawns that were trimmed to the same careful length every Sunday. Children rode bicycles down sidewalks lined with maple trees that turned golden October. Neighbors waved at one another every morning, exchanged small talk about weather and property taxes, and left their porch lights on for each other during storms. It was the kind of street people moved to when they wanted to believe the world was safe and orderly. Appearances could be deceiving. For almost 3 years, 34-year-old Maya Carter had lived quietly in the neighborhood with her husband, Daniel. She had chosen the house herself, walking through it twice before deciding it was the one, standing in the empty living room and imagining where the bookshelves would go. She had signed the mortgage papers with her own name listed first. It was a detail she was quietly proud of, though she never mentioned it to anyone. Maya was a hardworking woman who kept to herself. She worked remotely for a healthcare logistics company, spent 2 evenings a week volunteering at a community center 20 minutes from home, and used most of her weekends catching up on the small, unglamorous tasks of a full life. Grocery runs, laundry, long phone calls with her mother, who still lived for states away and worried about her only daughter more than Maya wished she would. She was not the kind of person who sought attention. She had learned, long before Maple Ridge, that being visible in the wrong way could be its own kind of danger. Daniel was often away because of his demanding job. To the neighbors, he was simply a quiet man who left early in dark, unmarked vehicles and returned late, sometimes not until well after the streetlights came on. Very few people on the block knew exactly what he did. Maya never brought it up at the mailbox or the community barbecue. Her marriage was private. Her life was peaceful. She had built that peace carefully, the way a person builds something they are afraid of losing, and she guarded it accordingly. That peace held for nearly 3 years, until a new neighbor moved into the house directly across the street. Her name was Patricia. Patricia arrived in early spring with moving trucks and a determined, efficient energy that impressed the block association within a week. She organized a welcome committee. She volunteered to manage the neighborhood newsletter. She was, by every visible measure, a good neighbor. But from the moment she unpacked her first box, something about Maya bothered her, in a way she could not fully explain even to herself. At first, it was small things. The car Maya drove, a newer model than Patricia expected for a woman who worked from home. The visitors who occasionally came to the house in the evening, mostly people from the community center, dropping off paperwork or picking up donated supplies. The fact that Maya sometimes returned from errands later than seemed reasonable to Patricia, though Patricia had no real way of knowing what reasonable meant for a life she had never asked about. Patricia began watching. Not obviously. Not with any conscious sense that she was doing something wrong. She told herself she was simply being observant, the way a good neighbor should be. She began noting the times Maya left and returned. She began noticing which nights Daniel's car was in the driveway and which nights it wasn't. Slowly, without any single dramatic moment to mark the shift, watching became suspicion. And suspicion, given enough quiet afternoons and unanswered questions, began sliding toward obsession. One afternoon in early June, Patricia saw Maya carrying several boxes into her house. She watched from behind her curtains, the fabric pulled back just enough to see the driveway. The boxes had arrived in an unmarked delivery van, plain white, no company logo on the side. Patricia immediately felt a prickle of alarm she could not justify with anything she actually knew. She began wondering, in the vague, escalating way that suspicion works, what exactly Maya was bringing into the neighborhood. Over the following weeks, Patricia noticed more. Maya sometimes received thick, official-looking envelopes, the kind that required a signature. Police vehicles occasionally drove down their street, slow and unhurried, the way patrol cars do on a normal patrol route. Patricia did not know this. She only knew what she saw from her window, stripped of context, and she filled in the missing pieces with whatever story frightened her most. And once, on a warm evening near the end of June, Patricia saw Daniel speaking quietly with two uniformed officers outside his own home. He stood with his arms crossed, nodding, occasionally glancing at a folder one of the officers held. Patricia did not know that Daniel worked with those officers. She did not know he was their superior. She did not know that he had spent more than 2 decades building a career in law enforcement, working his way up from patrol to detective to command staff through years most people never see. She simply saw what she wanted to see. And her suspicion, fed by nothing but silence and imagination, continued to grow. Then, on a Saturday morning in late July, something happened that pushed her over the edge. Maya left her house just after 8 in the morning, carrying a small black bag. Patricia watched from her window, coffee cooling in her hand. Maya walked toward her car in the driveway. She stopped, looked around the way anyone does when they're checking the street before backing out. Then she placed the bag carefully in the trunk of her car, the way a person handles something they don't want jostled. Patricia's mind moved fast, faster than reason could keep up with. She had spent weeks constructing a story in her head, and this felt, to her, like the final piece falling into place. She reached for her phone. She convinced herself, in the space of a few seconds, that she was witnessing something dangerous. Within minutes, she had called the police. But Patricia didn't tell the dispatcher everything she knew, because she didn't actually know anything. She described Maya as a suspicious woman who had been coming and going from the neighborhood. She emphasized, more than once, Thatch did not believe Maya belonged there. And then she said one thing that would later become extremely important. She told the dispatcher, in a voice she believed sounded calm and responsible, that she thought Maya might be involved in criminal activity. The call was recorded, time-stamped, and logged, the way every emergency call is. Patricia had no way of knowing that recording would eventually be played back to her, word for word, by people who would ask her to explain exactly what she had meant. Maya had barely closed her car door when she noticed the first police vehicle turning onto the street. Then a second. Then a third. She froze with her hand still on the door handle. She had nothing wrong that morning, nothing wrong that week, nothing wrong in 3 years off-quiet mornings on this street. And yet 3 police officers were now walking toward her, hands resting near their belts out of habit rather than threat, expressions carefully neutral. Neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by the sound of engines and doors. Patricia walked out onto her porch, arms folded, and for the first time all morning she looked satisfied. She believed the police had come because of her. She believed that whatever secret she had imagined behind Maya's quiet life was finally about to be exposed in front of the whole street. She had no idea how wrong she was about to be proven. And she had no idea that the man about to step out of the next car that turned onto Maple Ridge would change everything she thought she understood about the woman across the street. Maya calmly explained that she was confused. She kept her voice level, the way she had trained herself to over years of learning that a raised voice from a black woman facing police officers could be read as something it never was. The officers checked her identification. Everything was clean. Her driver's license matched the address on file. Her vehicle registration was valid. There were no warrants attached to her name, no criminal history, nothing. Still, Patricia insisted that something was wrong. She stepped off her porch and crossed the street, pointing toward Maya with the kind of certainty that comes from believing your own story too completely to question it. She demanded that the officers search the house. She said it loudly enough for 3 other neighbors to hear. The atmosphere on the street shifted immediately. What had been quiet, careful procedure turned uncomfortable. Maya's eyes filled with tears, though she fought to keep them from falling. She was not afraid of being arrested. There was nothing to arrest her for, and some steady part of her knew that. What frightened her, what actually broke something loose in her chest, was the understanding settling over her in real time. She was standing outside her own home, being questioned by armed strangers, because someone had decided, without a single fact, that she looked suspicious. She reached into her pocket and called her husband. Daniel answered on the second ring. Maya did not scream into the phone. She did not insult Patricia or demand that he come rescue her. She simply explained in short, controlled sentences that police officers were currently outside their home. There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than Maya expected. Daniel asked whether she was safe. She said eyes. Then she told him who had called the police and why. Daniel understood the seriousness of the situation immediately, in a way that had nothing to do with being her husband and everything to do with 22 years of experience reading exactly this kind of moment from the inside. But instead of sending another officer to handle it, or making a call that would quietly smooth things over, he told Maya to stay calm. He was already on his way. Maya had no idea what that meant. She assumed Daniel would come home, speak to their responding officers, clear things up, and the morning would end the way most bad mornings eventually do. She had no idea that within minutes, word would move through the department that the chief's own address had come up on a call. She had no idea that Daniel wasn't going Torev as a husband defending his wife. He was going to arrive as the man ultimately responsible for how every officer on that street conducted themselves, in his own neighborhood, in front of his own home. 10 minutes later, a fourth vehicle pulled onto Maple Ridge. This time, every officer standing near Maya straightened almost involuntarily, the way people do around rank without needing to think about it. Daniel stepped out in uniform. The 3 responding officers recognized him instantly. So did several of the neighbors, who suddenly remembered, with the strange delayed recognition of people who had never actually looked closely at their own street, that they had occasionally seen this exact man leaving in the mornings. Patricia did not recognize him at all. She watched, confused, as the officers who had seemed so certain a moment earlier now shifted their posture, deferring to a man she had never once spoken to in 4 months of living across the street. Daniel walked directly to his wife first. He checked on her before he checked on anything else, his hand settling gently on her shoulder, his eyes moving briefly over her face before turning to the officers. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten Patricia, who was still standing several feet away with her arms crossed, some of her earlier certainty beginning to drain out of her posture. He simply asked the responding officers, in a calm, even voice, for a complete account of what had happened. They explained everything, laying out the sequence exactly as it occurred. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then he asked for the original emergency call. One of the officers confirmed it had been recorded and logged. Daniel requested, formally, that the recording be preserved as part of the file. Patricia's stomach dropped. She had expected, in whatever version of this morning she had imagined while dialing the phone, that the police would side with her. She had not expected the chief of the entire department to be the husband of the woman she had reported. And what came next surprised her even more. Daniel did not use his position to punish her on the spot. He didn't raise his voice or threaten her career or her freedom. Instead, he instructed the officers to treat the complaint exactly as they would treat any other complaint that Camathru dispatched that morning. No differently, no special exceptions in either direction. Maya, standing beside him, understood something in that moment that she would carry with her for a long time afterward. Her husband was not going to bend the law to protect her frozen, uncomfortable process. He was going to use the law, carefully and fairly, to protect everyone standing on that street, including the woman who had wronged her. One of the officers, glancing at Maya's open trunk, gently asked about the black bag Patricia had described in her call. Maya walked over and opened it herself, without hesitation, because Sesh had nothing to hide and had never had anything to hide. Inside were documents, medical records, photographs, several handwritten letters. The paper told a story none of the officers, and certainly not Patricia, had expected. For over a year, May had been quietly helping families through the community center's outreach program, work she had never once mentioned to a single neighbor. One letter was from an elderly widow whose rent Maya had covered anonymously for 2 months after the woman lost her part-time job. Another was from a teenager whose school fees Maya had helped pay so he could finish his final year without dropping out to work full-time. A third letter, folded more carefully than the others, belonged to a mother and 2 children who had recently fled an abusive household. Maya had been helping them relocate safely, coordinating with a shelter 2 counties over, driving paperwork back and forth in a small black bag so nothing would be lost or left behind. She had never told anyone, not the neighbors, not the block newsletter, not even Patricia, who had spent months constructing a criminal out of a woman quietly keeping other people's worst days from getting worse. The bag Patricia had described to a dispatcher as evidence of danger contained, in reality, evidence of exactly the opposite. If a story like this moves you, take a moment to like this video and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps this story reach more people who need to hear it, and there's still more coming, because what Daniel noticed next changed the entire shape of this investigation. Because as Daniel scanned the documents, his expression shifted. One name, written on an intake form near the bottom of the stack, stopped him completely. It was a name connected to a case that had sat unsolved in his department for months. A man who had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind a family that investigators had never been able to fully locate. Daniel had reviewed that file more times than he could count. He looked up from the paper slowly. Whatever this Saturday morning had started out as a neighborhood complaint, a misunderstanding, a mistake born out of assumption, it had just become something else entirely. And nobody standing on that street yet understood how far it was about to go. Daniel ordered the responding officers to secure the documents properly and log them as part of an active investigation. The papers in Maya's bag did not prove she had done anything wrong. They never had, but they strongly suggested she had unknowingly been helping a family connected to a case his department had been working for months. Maya explained everything she knew, calmly and completely. She had been assisting a frightened mother and her 2 children through the community program. She had never known, because there had been no reason for her to know, that one of the names tied to that family situation was also tied to an open investigation involving a missing man. Patricia watched all of this unfold from a few feet away, her earlier confidence gone completely. She understood, in the plain and undeniable way facts sometimes arrive all at once, that she had been wrong about Maya in every possible way. But the morning was not finished revealing itself yet, and what came next was far more uncomfortable for her than anything that had happened so far. Investigators reviewing the case pulled the original emergency call Patricia had made. Listening to it back, several of her statements did not hold up. She had described things she had never actually witnessed. She had stated, with confidence, suspicions she had no basis for. Then, as procedure required, investigators checked the call history for the address. There had been other complaints about Maya over the past several months, some anonymous. Several placed directly by Patricia herself, at hours when nothing unusual had actually been happening on the street at all. Maya had never known any of this. For months, quietly and repeatedly, Patricia had been reporting her, each call small enough on its own to seem forgettable, but adding up together, into a pattern investigators could no longer ignore. The full picture that emerged over the following hour was worse than a single misunderstanding. Patricia had been telling other neighbors, in private conversations at the mailbox and over backyard fences, that Maya was dangerous, that something about her didn't add up. She had photographed Maya's house from her window on more than one occasion. She had kept informal notes on which visitors came and went. She had even approached the neighborhood association about looking into whether Maya had purchased her home through legitimate means, a question she had never once considered asking about any other family on the block. There was no evidence, anywhere, of a crime committed by Maya. There was, however, a clear and uncomfortable pattern of obsession on Patricia's part, built entirely out of assumptions she had never bothered to check. When investigators finally asked her directly why she had focused so intensely on one neighbor, Patricia gave an answer that surprised even her. She admitted that Maya simply hadn't behaved the way she expected someone in the neighborhood to behave. She hadn't been able to explain it any more clearly than that, because there had never actually been anything to explain. That admission broke something in Maya, though not in the way anyone watching might have expected. She wasn't reacting to an insult. She was reacting to the sudden, exhausting weight off, realizing how long she had been quietly carrying the burden of somebody else's imagination. She began to cry, standing in her own driveway, in front of her own home, for the first time letting the morning's fear catch up with her all at once. She said, through the tears, that she had spent years of her life trying to prove she deserved to be treated the same as everyone else on a street like this one. She had worked for her house. She had paid every bill on time. She had quietly helped strangers who needed it more than she needed recognition for it. She had built a marriage and a home and a life. And none of that had mattered, in the space of one Saturday morning, against a stranger's untested suspicion. Daniel stood beside her and said nothing for a long moment. For the first time that morning, the man everyone deferred to had nothing procedural left to offer. He simply held his wife's hand while she cried in front of the same neighbors who had come outside to watch. Patricia expected, reasonably, that this was the part where she would be arrested. Daniel didn't do that. Instead, once Maya had composed herself, he explained to Patricia, in a measure-read voice, that being wrong about a neighbor was not on its own a criminal act. But knowingly making false statements to an emergency dispatcher, repeatedly, over months, was a different matter, and one his department would review formally, through the same process used for any resident of that city. Everything was documented: the original call, the pattern of prior complaints, the photographs Patricia had taken without anyone's knowledge. Officers informed her that continuing to monitor or contact Maya would now be treated as harassment, and that further complaints would be handled accordingly. Then Maya did something nobody standing on that street expected, including Daniel. She asked him not to pursue the harshest possible outcome against Patricia. She said clearly Thatch didn't want revenge. She wanted Patricia to actually understand, not just be punished, what months of suspicion had cost her. Maya said she knew exactly what it felt like to be judged before being known, and she didn't want to hand that same feeling to someone else, even Somyeon, who had earned it. Patricia began crying then too, for what seemed like the first time all morning without any performance behind it. She looked at Maya, standing there with her husband's hand still wrapped around hers, and for the first time in 4 months, she actually saw her as a person rather than a shape behind a curtain. Just when it seemed the morning had finally reached its end, Daniel's phone rang. It was one of High's investigators. The documents recovered from Maya's black bag had helped the department locate the missing family connected to the stalled case. A family investigators had been searching for over 3 months without success. Maya's quiet, unpublicized kindness, the exact thing Patricia had mistaken for danger, had accidentally handed the department the one piece of information it had been missing. The woman Patricia had called suspicious had, without ever knowing it, been helping people the entire time. The woman she believed didn't belong on that street turned out to be the reason a family separated by fear was finally found and brought somewhere safe. Weeks later, the department formally cleared Maya of any wrongdoing, a conclusion that had honestly never been in serious doubt. Word moved through the neighborhood the way it always does. Some neighbors apologized, awkwardly, at the mailbox or through a note left on her door. Others avoided her out of their own embarrassment, unsure how to face what they had silently allowed to happen a few feet from their own front doors. Patricia eventually walked across the street herself. She didn't bring excuses. She didn't try to explain away 4 months of watching, recording, and suspecting. She simply told Maya plainly that she had judged her without ever once trying to know her. Maya listened to all of it. Then she forgave her. Not because what Patricia had done was acceptable, and not because forgiveness erased any of it. She forgave her because she refused to let someone else's fear keep shaping the rest of her own life. In time, the woman who had once stood outside her own home, while strangers decided whether she belonged there, became one of the most quietly respected people on that street. And Patricia carried a lesson with her long after that Saturday morning had ended, one she never spoke about publicly, but never forgot either. The person you are quickest to judge is often the one you never took the time to actually know. Maya never forgot that morning. Neither did Daniel. But they made a choice not to let one ugly incident define the years that came after it. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with handcuffs and flashing lights. Sometimes it arrives quietly, when the truth simply becomes impossible to keep ignoring. And sometimes the most powerful answer to someone else's fear is refusing to let it turn you into something you're not. If this story reached you, carry this with you. Never measure someone's worth by their skin, their car, their clothes, or the story you've built about them in your own head before you ever spoke a single word to them. The person you're so quick to judge may be carrying a story far bigger than anything you imagined. This isn't the last story like this one. There's another family, another street, another morning that changes everything, waiting in the next video. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it.